It is an honor to chair the subcommittee and to provide a platform for listening to and supporting small businesses across America. Though our members may disagree on occasion on matters of policy, I want to make it clear that we work for you, the small business owners present today, and the small business owners across the country pursuing the American dream. I look forward to conducting this hearing and this year's work in a productive and bipartisan manner with Ranking Member Van Dyne. Since the implementation of the New Deal in the 1930s, Congress has been tasked with determining, from our collective belief of what is fair and what is right, a standard of living under which no working American citizen should fall. An essential part of this floor is the minimum wage, which was intended to ensure that the least advantaged workers in America can provide for themselves, let alone for their families. But over the past decades, this floor has significantly eroded in value, despite a modest increase to $7.25 per hour in 2009. Meanwhile, Washington is caught in partisan gridlock and unable to provide the leadership so desperately needed to resolve the issue, despite overwhelming public support for addressing it. It is my core belief that all working Americans who live on the wages that they earn be paid one on which they can survive. It's not just good for humanity, it is good for our economy, because consumption is the engine of our economy and money in people's pockets is its fuel. Unfortunately, the current minimum wage falls well below the poverty line for a family of two or more. And I cannot imagine that anybody in this room or participating today would say that it is fair and just for any American relying on a full-time wage to survive to earn only $15,000 per year. That cannot make rent, that cannot pay for food, it cannot pay for health care, it cannot pay for child care, and it surely cannot pay for education in any region of our country. But, as I said during our markup just 2 weeks ago, I'm troubled that the Raise the Wage Act was included in this COVID relief package without more opportunities for small business voices to be heard and thoughtful members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to offer constructive feedback and amendments. And that's why we're here today, my friends. I'm certain that all of us in this room have heard from small businesses and hardworking people in our districts about the impact, both the positive impacts and the negative impacts, that this policy change would have. In my office, we heard from Ken, the owner of the original Pancake House in Plymouth, Minnesota, one of my favorite joints. Like so many businesses which rely on public gathering to succeed, he is barely hanging on. His restaurant, like all restaurants, runs on thin margins during even the best of times, and Ken is deeply concerned that a $15 minimum wage will mean that he has to cut jobs if he hopes to stay open. I take these concerns seriously, and they are guiding how we will conduct this hearing today. However, we cannot ignore the benefits that our economy would reap from raising the minimum wage. We often hear from small firms how hard it is to attract and retain skilled workers, and experts say that this policy could help. Studies also suggest it can make workers more productive and boost morale. According to the CBO, the policy, as it is written, would likely raise wages for 27 million Americans, raise almost 1 million out of poverty, and increase the aggregate wages for low-wage workers in America by over $300 billion over the next decade. These newly empowered workers will live in turn to support local businesses and our entire economy. It's also essential that we address this through a racial and gender equity lens. Women and minorities would disproportionately benefit from a $15 minimum wage, which would close pay gaps based on both race and gender. Unfortunately, the same CBO study also projects that this policy, as it's written, could cost up to 1.4 million American jobs, and intuition tells us it would also result in the loss of a number of small businesses, both of which are consequences which I find as unacceptable as they are preventable. It is our duty on this committee to listen to the voices of small businesses and support them accordingly. And while we may disagree on whether to increase the minimum wage or by how much or in what manner, I hope and I expect that we'll come together for a cordial, productive, and even provocative hearing that will serve the best interests of small businesses, their employees, and our communities. Lastly, and most importantly, I ask that we use our time today to identify ways in which we can mitigate the negative impacts of such a policy while maximizing the positive impacts of raising wages for millions of Americans. As I said 2 weeks ago, and I'll say it again right now, livable wages, thriving businesses, and job growth are not mutually exclusive options. So let's work together to achieve that trifecta, beginning with today's hearing. Dr. Scherholz, I'll start with you. A report published by your colleagues at the Economic Policy Institute in January of last year, 2020, argued that policy discussions often treat the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC expansion, and minimum wage increases as alternatives, of which we should simply choose just one. But in reality, of course, the paper argues also that, quote, the two policies are complementary and may be more effective in combination than either is on its own, end quote. So before I move on, I would like to ask for unanimous consent to insert this report from EPI into the committee record. Without objection, the letter will be inserted. So my question, Dr. Scherholz, is please speak to how tax provisions like the EITC and the payroll tax credit can and perhaps should be used to balance the burden placed on small businesses that would result from higher wages.
Unmute. Okay, so this is a really important topic. So I think that the EITC, for example, the EITC and strong and minimum wages are often presented as being in opposition, but they are absolutely companion pieces. The EITC in particular is just an incredibly important program, but one fundamental issue with it is that because workers get the EITC, they will actually accept lower base wages from employers, and this means employers actually capture a meaningful chunk of expenditures on the EITC. So a strong minimum wage is hugely important in this context because it limits the amount of EITC expenditures that employers can capture. So it's just these two pieces go hand in hand. At this point, it's definitely a both and. We should both increase the EITC and increase minimum wages to 15 in 2025.
Okay, thank you. I also want to follow up with Ms. Gressler. In your written testimony, you discuss how the EITC essentially ensures that parents do not earn a true minimum wage and that gains from the EITC would phase out as workers earn more. So could you expand a little bit on how those two notions, the two policies would interact and what conditions in the labor market would need to be present to maximize the EITC's usefulness and describe how it might be modified to boost the economic security of low-wage workers?
Yeah, I think this is an example where, we have these good policy aims, but then there are consequences to them as well. And so the consequence with the earned income tax credit is, of course, that it has to phase out eventually over time. And when you're phasing out, that's a lower rate that individuals are earning. And when you talk about increasing the minimum wage, that's going to impact a fair number of single parents who are earning lower wages. Even if it's above the 725, this could potentially push them into the phase out zone of the earned income tax credit. And whereas they might have been getting a 35 or 40% subsidy on their wages previously, now they would be getting 21% lower than their actual stated wage because of that phase out. And so it's tricky here to find the right balance between those things. But I think that the point is that we do have a program that is specifically aimed at working parents, and that's different than the minimum wage, which affects everybody, including teenagers and the people who need to get their foot into the door. And that's kind of the basis here, is that the minimum wage needs to be the bottom rungs on the career ladder so that people can step in and they can climb their way up. And we don't want to cut those off for tens of millions of Americans.
Okay, thank you. I've got about a minute left. Mr. Puckett, one area that I think we have failed to investigate and consider much is how a policy like this will surely help millions, tens of millions of Americans at the lowest wage scale. But how would it affect an entity like Punch Pizza with 300 people? I think you mentioned 7 tiers of pay. How would this increase ultimately affect the entire wage inflation issue, if you will, at a company like Punch?
Thank you, Chairman Phillips. That's a good question, and we're really experiencing that today. As you probably know, about half our stores are in the Minneapolis-St. Paul markets, and both of those markets will be going to $15 an hour in the next 18 to 30 months. And we do offer significant boost to wage above our starting wage. And thus far, we've handled that and encouraged that increase in our employee skills. But it is a significant inflation. Our total labor cost is about 40% of sales. The flip side is we think advancement and giving our employees a chance to build a career. The alternative to that is not very good. A job with no career or no advancement. So we're trying to figure it out. We look forward to having customers in our dining rooms and business restored so we can get back to more normalcy. But it is definitely a challenge, and it's gonna, as anything at Punch, we have a saying on our wall: "Figure it out." We're gonna figure it out.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Mr. Puckett. My time has expired. First, I've enjoyed this discussion, and it's exactly what I believe we've needed. I also want to point out some facts that of the OECD countries, the United States currently ranks 14th of all the countries with a minimum wage of $7.30, 25 cents. We are just below Slovenia and just ahead of Poland. Our neighbors to the north, Canada, each province has a significantly higher minimum wage than we do in the United States, including Ontario, at $14.25 Canadian, which based on current exchange rates is about $11.40. They also make certain exceptions for students, for servers, and for those who work from home. My question is to Ms. Gressler. I'm curious if you've done any research relative to how the minimum wage in Canada affects the Canadian economy vis-a-vis our very low wage here in the U.S.
I haven't looked specifically at that, but I would just point out that regardless of what the minimum wage is, what matters is what people are actually making. And we have seen in the United States that not only are people having higher incomes and earning more, but that we've also had a lower unemployment rate. And so there are fewer people who aren't able to find jobs.
Do you have a sense of what the median wage is in the United States versus Canada?
I don't know Canada's.
Okay.
I believe the U.S. is around $25 per hour.
Okay. Perhaps the most important question is, my hope was that this hearing results in some ideas and ways to mitigate any potential policy effects. So if in fact, Ms. Gressler, that this policy were to be instituted as written, what would you argue would be the most important mitigating policies that could prevent job losses and ensure that small businesses do not close, if this was enacted as written?
I think the most important thing would be to not implement a one-size-fits-all, and so to have a provision in there, much like the federal government does for the general schedule pay scale that has locality-based adjustments, and to allow state and local governments to tie it to their median wage in that area so that you don't disproportionately impact those lower cost areas.
Okay, but if it's enacted as written, which does not provide for any of those opportunities, what would you propose we consider to mitigate the effects?
Well, I think you would have. I don't have any good proposal there because I think that the mitigation measures would be so large and consequential for the long-term economy that it's not something that we would want to do. We're talking about pitting small businesses against big businesses, lower cost areas of living against higher cost areas of living. This is just not simply something that will work well across the United States.
Okay. I'll close my questioning back to Mr. Puckett. Mr. Puckett, if you're already paying essentially close to this minimum wage, and by the time this was fully in effect 5 years hence, you'd probably be over it. But based on your experience in business, building Caribou, building Punch, what would you argue we should be looking at as we reflect on the potential consequences? I think we'd all agree that there are some benefits and there will be some consequences. What would you like to see us consider as some potential mitigating policies if we were to enact this wage scale based on its current construct?
Thank you for the question. we're blessed to be operating in a great environment in the Twin Cities, very competitive. So it's made us adapt and stay ahead of that for our people strategy. I do feel I have sympathy for small businesses all across the country in areas that this would be potentially a much bigger jump than what Punch faces. So I don't have any specific policy recommendations, but I think, considering the different needs in rural versus urban, different parts of the country is certainly an idea. I was curious how Canada's system works. People that are trying to, I don't know if it's possible to differentiate people that are household heads or this is their main source of living as a differentiation between someone that's doing that or a part-time student. But those are things that could be considered, I assume.
Well, thanks, Mr. Buck, and I agree. I think we should look to best practices as practiced by some of our peers around the world. And with that, I will yield to Ms. Van Dyne, our ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank our witnesses for joining us today, and my fellow members. This was the kind of discussion that we need more of. I think it's fair to say that we all agree. We want to see Americans' wages go up. We want to see more jobs created, not fewer. And we want to see businesses thrive, especially small businesses that are the backbone of our economy and the backbone of our communities. And as many of you know, I've built businesses, some very successful larger ones, and currently own a small business that does pay a $15 minimum wage. Not because the law requires it, not because it's easy, rather it's a principle in which my partners and I believe. But I hear small businesses every single day concerned about this policy, and I understand their concerns. I know we all do, and I'm grateful that we were able to give voice to some of those concerns in today's hearing. We've got to consider options for raising wages for the least advantaged in our country. I believe they've been denied that for far too long, and we have a responsibility. So I am committed to working together with all of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, in a bipartisan fashion to build a better economy for our small businesses and for the people that build them, employees and owners. I talk about the trifecta: wages, higher wages, more jobs, and more businesses. So I ask that we focus on that, not just obstruct and not just demand that we not proceed, rather come up with solutions on how we can achieve all three, because I do not believe they are mutually exclusive. And I want to see America once again be at the forefront. I want to see us be the fastest growing economy and the country to which our peers look to for the best policy in the world. So with that, I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without any objection, so ordered. And if there's no further business before the committee, we are now adjourned. Thanks, everybody.